She built a $42 million empire from a rented kitchen and a broken heart. Then her own son sat a doctor across from her and tried to convince a judge that the woman who built it all had lost her mind. What he never expected was that she already knew. She built an empire with her bare hands, and her own son tried to take it from her by calling her insane. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Eleanor May Whitfield, a woman who was told by doctors, lawyers, and even her own child that her mind could no longer be trusted, while all along it was her mind, sharper than anyone gave her credit for, that was quietly building the very trap that would bring her son's plan crashing down around him. Eleanor May Whitfield did not start with money. She started with nothing but a rented kitchen, a debt she could barely pay, and a stubborn belief that no one else in her family shared. She was raised in a small house outside of Charleston, South Carolina, the third of 6 children, in a home where dinner some nights was whatever her mother could stretch across 7 plates. Her father worked 2 jobs and still came home exhausted with empty pockets. Eleanor watched her mother cook for the whole neighborhood during hard times, feeding people who had even less than they did. And something about the way food brought people together, the way it made grown men cry and children laugh, planted itself deep inside her long before she understood what to do with it. By the time Eleanor was 26 years old, she had already buried a husband who died far too young, and she had a 5-year-old daughter to raise alone. She took the only skill she had, the cooking her mother taught her standing on a wooden stool as a child, and turned it into something that could keep a roof over their heads. She started small, cooking meals out of her cramped apartment kitchen for neighbors willing to pay a few dollars, then for church gatherings, then for small local events. People began to talk. Her food had a way of making people remember things, remember home, remember family, remember exactly why they had gathered together in the first place. It took Eleanor almost 15 years of 18-hour days, of turning away sleep, of missing her daughter's school plays because a wedding needed feeding, before Whitfield Catering and Events became a name spoken with respect across 3 counties. And it took another 20 years after that before it became something far bigger. A company with contracts across the entire Southeast, event halls in 4 cities, and a staff of over 300 people who depended on Eleanor for their livelihoods. She had built something that outlasted the husband she lost. Something that fed thousands of families the way her mother once fed a struggling neighborhood. And by the time she reached 65 years old, Eleanor May Whitfield was worth just over $42 million. She never once forgot where she came from. She still answered her own phone. She still walked her own kitchens unannounced to taste the food herself. She still remembered every employee's name. And she still believed, perhaps naively, that the 2 people she loved most in this world, her son Marcus and her granddaughter Grace, would never see her as anything other than the mother and grandmother who raised them. Marcus Whitfield had grown up watching his mother build something extraordinary, but he had never once had to sacrifice the way she did to get there. He was given private schooling, a car at 17, an apartment paid for during his college years, and a comfortable cushion beneath him at all times. Eleanor believed she was protecting her son from the hardship she had endured. What she did not realize was that she was raising a man who believed comfort was owed to him rather than earned. A man who watched his mother's empire grow and quietly began to see it not as something built through decades of labor, but as something he was simply waiting his turn to inherit. By the time Marcus turned 41, he had built a career in finance that looked impressive on the surface. A corner office, a title that sounded important, a wife named Denise who filled their home with expensive things, and their social calendar with expensive company. But underneath that surface, Marcus Whitfield was drowning. A series of bad investments, 2 failed business ventures he had convinced himself would make him wealthy independent of his mother's name, and a lifestyle he refused to scale back, had left him nearly $900,000 in debt, a number he had hidden from everyone, including his own wife, for almost 2 years. Denise suspected something was wrong long before Marcus admitted it. The late-night phone calls he took in the garage, the way he flinched every time a certain number called his cell phone, the credit cards that quietly stopped working one by one. When Marcus finally broke down and told her the truth, sitting in the dark of their kitchen at 2 in the morning, Denise did not comfort him the way he expected. She asked him a single question that would set everything in motion. She asked him how much of his mother's fortune was supposed to be his one day, and how long he intended to wait for it. That question sat in Marcus's mind for weeks. He told himself he was not the kind of man who would ever hurt his mother, but debt has a way of rewriting what a person believes about themselves. He began watching Eleanor differently, no longer as a son watches a mother, but as a man watches an obstacle. He noticed the small things now, the times she repeated a story she had already told, the reading glasses she sometimes misplaced, the pause she took before remembering a name, ordinary things, the kind that happened to any person growing older. But Marcus began writing them down. He began collecting them like evidence, because somewhere in the desperation of his hidden debt, an idea had taken root, an idea that felt to him less like betrayal and more like survival. Grace Whitfield, Eleanor's granddaughter, had a very different relationship with her grandmother than her uncle Marcus did. Grace was the daughter of Eleanor's late daughter, who had passed away when Grace was only 9 years old, and from that day forward, Eleanor had raised her as her own. Grace grew up in the kitchens of Whitfield Catering, learning to fold napkins before she learned to write cursive, sitting in the back of business meetings long before she understood what a profit margin was. She was now 22 years old, in her final year of law school, and she had inherited something from Eleanor that Marcus never had, the understanding that nothing worth having comes without sacrifice. Grace noticed her uncle's behavior shifting months before anyone else did. The extra visits to her grandmother's house that Marcus had never bothered to make before. The way he began asking Eleanor questions that felt less like conversation and more like an assessment, questions about what year it was, about what she had eaten for breakfast, about whether she remembered a conversation from the week before. Grace mentioned it once to her grandmother, gently, carefully, and Eleanor had simply smiled the way she always did when she already understood something before anyone had to explain it to her. What Grace did not know yet, what nobody knew yet except for Eleanor herself and one man she trusted with everything, was that Eleanor May Whitfield had already noticed her son's questions long before Grace ever did. She had noticed the pen he carried into every visit now, the way he wrote things down when he thought she wasn't looking, the strange new interest he had taken in her medications and her doctor's appointments. Eleanor had built an empire by reading rooms other people walked past without a second thought, and she was not about to let her own son outmaneuver her in the one room that mattered most, her own home, her own mind, her own legacy. She picked up her phone that evening, the same evening she stood alone in her living room holding a photograph of her late husband, and she called the one person who had never once doubted her judgment in over 30 years of friendship. She called Harold Bennett, her attorney, her confidant, the man who had drafted every contract, every will, every legal document that protected the empire she had spent her whole life building. When Harold answered, Eleanor did not waste time with small talk. She said only one sentence, quiet and steady, the same tone she used the day she signed the lease on her very first commercial kitchen decades earlier. She told him that her son was planning something, and that she intended to be ready for it before he even realized she knew. Marcus sat at his kitchen island long after Denise had gone to bed, the blue light of his laptop screen the only light in the room, columns of numbers glowing red against the darkness. $900,000. The number had stopped feeling real to him months ago, and yet every time he opened that spreadsheet, it sat there waiting for him, patient and unmoving, like a debt collector who never had to knock because it already lived inside his own home. He heard footsteps behind him and did not need to turn around to know it was Denise. She had a way of appearing in doorways when she sensed her husband unraveling, as though she could smell desperation the way other people smelled rain coming. Denise did not ask him how bad it had gotten this time. She had asked that question enough times to already know the answer would only make her angrier. Instead, she asked him what he was going to do about it, and Marcus, for the first time in their 14 years of marriage, told her the truth about the idea that had been forming in the back of his mind for weeks. He told her that his mother was getting older, that she repeated herself sometimes, that she misplaced things, that a good lawyer and a cooperative doctor could make a case that Eleanor May Whitfield was no longer fit to manage a fortune worth over $40 million. He told her that as her only son, he would be first in line to take control of that fortune the moment a court agreed with him. Denise was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus almost believed she was about to talk him out of it, the way the old Denise might have years earlier before the debt, before the late nights, before the version of their marriage that existed now. Instead, she walked over, sat down beside him, and asked him a question that would echo through everything that followed. She asked him if he had already found a doctor willing to help. Marcus nodded slowly and told her about a name a colleague had given him weeks earlier, a psychiatrist named Dr. Richard Coleman, known in certain circles for evaluations that tended to favor whoever was paying his fee. Dr. Richard Coleman's office sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of address that told you before you even sat down that his services did not come cheap. Marcus had heard the name from a colleague at his firm, a man who mentioned it in passing over drinks. The way people mention things they know are not entirely legal, but not entirely illegal either. Dr. Coleman specialized in competency evaluations, the kind used in courtrooms to determine whether an aging parent could still manage their own affairs, and his reputation, quiet as it was kept, suggested he understood which side of a family dispute tended to pay his invoices. Marcus sat across from him now, a manila folder resting on his lap, the folder he had spent the last 2 months filling with notes. Every misplaced set of keys, every repeated story, every pause before a name. He had written it all down with the discipline of a man building a legal case rather than a son worried about his mother. Because somewhere in his mind, Marcus had already stopped being her son and started being her opponent. Dr. Coleman flipped through the folder slowly, his expression unreadable, the kind of neutral professional face that had likely sat across from dozens of families exactly like this one. Dr. Coleman explained the process in a calm, measured voice, the way a man explains something he has explained many times before. He told Marcus that a formal competency evaluation would require several sessions with Eleanor herself, sessions that could be framed as routine wellness checkups so as not to alarm her, along with statements from family members and caregivers who had witnessed her decline. He told Marcus that with the right documentation, courts were often quick to grant conservatorship petitions, especially when the family member requesting it appeared reasonable, concerned, and acting only in their parents' best interest. Marcus asked him plainly what his fee would be to make sure the evaluation reached the conclusion Marcus needed it to reach. Dr. Coleman did not flinch at the question. He simply named a number, and Marcus, without hesitation, agreed to pay it. Marcus left that office feeling something he had not expected to feel, a strange mixture of relief and shame sitting uncomfortably together in his chest. He told himself once again, the way he had told himself every night for weeks, that this was not betrayal. He told himself his mother was getting older regardless, that someone would need to manage her affairs eventually, and that it was better for that someone to be her own son rather than a stranger. He told himself these things all the way down 14 floors in the elevator, and he almost believed them by the time he reached the parking garage. Almost, what Marcus did not know, what he could not have known sitting in that cold glass office convincing himself of his own good intentions, was that his mother had built her entire empire by understanding exactly how people like Dr. Coleman thought. She had negotiated with contractors who tried to overcharge her, vendors who tried to shortchange her, and competitors who tried to poach her staff, and in every single case, Eleanor May Whitfield had learned to see the trap before the other person finished setting it. Marcus believed he was several steps ahead of his mother. In truth, he had not yet realized that his mother was already several steps ahead of him. Harold Bennett arrived at Eleanor's estate the following afternoon, carrying the same worn leather briefcase he had carried into her life over 30 years earlier, back when Eleanor was a woman with nothing but a catering contract and a dream too big for the kitchen she was cooking in. He had watched her build Whitfield Catering and Events from a single rented commercial kitchen into an empire spanning 4 cities, and in all those years, he had never once seen fear in her eyes the way he saw something else there now. Not fear exactly, but the sharp, focused calm of a woman preparing for a fight she intended to win before it even began. Eleanor told Harold everything she had noticed over the past several weeks. The extra visits from Marcus that always seemed to come with a pen and a notepad rather than affection. The pointed questions disguised as casual conversation. Questions about what day it was, about medications she took, about conversations from days earlier that Marcus would later claim she did not remember correctly, even when she remembered them perfectly well. She told Harold about the folder she suspected Marcus was keeping, though she had never seen it directly, because a mother knows the shape of her own son's schemes even when she cannot see the paper they are written on. Harold listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when Eleanor finished, he asked her the question that mattered most. He asked her whether she wanted him to confront Marcus directly, to end this before it went any further. Eleanor shook her head slowly. She told Harold that confronting Marcus now would only teach him to hide his intentions better, to find a smarter lawyer, a more careful doctor, a cleaner paper trail. She told Harold that if her son wanted to build a case against her mind, then she intended to let him build it, every piece of it, in full view, until the moment came to show the world exactly how flawed and desperate that case truly was. Eleanor's plan, as she laid it out to Harold that afternoon, was elegant in its simplicity. She would not fight Marcus's questions or resist his so-called wellness visits. Instead, she would begin documenting everything herself, quietly recording certain conversations with his knowledge revoked, keeping a private journal with exact dates and details that would later prove her memory was sharper than anyone accused her of being. She would also, with Harold's help, begin a discreet legal maneuver of her own, transferring certain protections over her estate into a trust structure so ironclad that even a successful conservatorship claim would leave Marcus controlling far less than he imagined he was fighting for. Harold began writing notes immediately, the same way he had 30 years earlier when Eleanor first described a business plan that everyone else in the room had called impossible. Before Harold left that evening, Eleanor asked him one more thing. She asked him to quietly look into Dr. Richard Coleman, the psychiatrist she suspected Marcus had already begun consulting, a name she had heard mentioned once by an acquaintance whose own family had gone through something similar years earlier. Harold promised her he would have information within the week. As he gathered his briefcase and walked toward the door, he turned back and told Eleanor something he had told her many times over the decades of their friendship, that he had never once seen anyone outmaneuver her, and he did not expect her own son to be the first. Grace Whitfield sat alone in the law library that night, the way she had sat alone in that same library most nights that semester, surrounded by textbooks on trusts and estates that felt strangely personal now, in a way they never had before. Her phone lit up on the table beside her with a text message from her Uncle Marcus, asking her, almost too casually, whether her grandmother had mentioned anything unusual lately, whether Eleanor had seemed forgetful, whether anything at all seemed off. Grace stared at the message for a long time before responding, because something about the phrasing bothered her in a way she could not immediately name. Grace had grown up watching her grandmother run board meetings with total command of every number, every contract, every employee's name across 300-person company. She had watched Eleanor negotiate deals that made seasoned businessmen visibly nervous, had watched her recall conversations from years earlier with startling precision, had watched her remain, at 68 years old, one of the sharpest minds in any room she entered. The idea that her grandmother was suddenly forgetful struck Grace as not just wrong, but almost insulting, and the fact that it was Marcus asking, Marcus who rarely visited before all of this began, made the question feel less like concern and more like something else entirely. She thought back to the last time she had visited her grandmother's estate, only 2 weeks earlier, and remembered Eleanor mentioning, almost in passing, that Marcus had started visiting more often, always with a notepad, always asking questions that felt rehearsed rather than natural. At the time, Grace had assumed it was simply Marcus finally showing the attention he should have been showing his mother all along. Now, sitting alone in the quiet library with his text message glowing on her phone, that assumption felt naive in a way that unsettled her. Grace closed her textbook and made a decision she would return to many times over the following weeks. She decided not to answer Marcus's question directly. Instead, she called her grandmother. Eleanor answered on the second ring, her voice as steady and warm as always, and when Grace asked her, carefully, whether everything was all right, Eleanor paused just long enough for Grace to notice it before answering that everything was exactly as it should be, and that she would explain everything soon, when the time was right. Grace sat with the phone still in her hand long after the call ended, staring at the darkened windows of the library, aware for the first time that whatever was happening inside her family, it had already begun, and she was only now catching up to it. Marcus and Denise arrived for Sunday dinner exactly the way they had for the past several weeks, with gifts in hand and warmth in their voices, the kind of performed affection that Eleanor recognized instantly for what it was, though she gave no indication of recognizing anything at all. She greeted them at the door with the same embrace she had always given, asked about Denise's work with the same interest she had always shown, and sat at the head of her long dining table, watching her son pull out her chair for her, with a gentleness that had not existed in his behavior 6 months earlier. Throughout dinner, Marcus asked his questions the way he had learned to ask them, wrapped inside ordinary conversation so they would not sound like the assessment they truly were. He asked Eleanor what she thought of the new restaurant that had opened downtown, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked whether she remembered the name of the chef there, a name Eleanor had mentioned to him herself only 2 weeks earlier. He asked about her medication schedule under the guise of concern for her health, took mental note of her answer, and steered the conversation toward her weekly calendar, asking what appointments she had coming up as though simply making conversation. Eleanor answered every question with complete accuracy: the chef's name, her medication schedule, her appointments for the coming week, but she answered them slowly, thoughtfully, occasionally pausing as though searching for the right word, occasionally repeating a small detail she had already mentioned moments earlier. She watched Marcus's eyes each time she did this, watched the flicker of something he tried to hide, something that looked almost like satisfaction, and she understood in that moment that her son was not simply asking questions anymore. He was collecting evidence, and every hesitation she offered him, deliberately, generously, was being written into a story he intended to tell a judge. Denise, for her part, said little throughout the meal, though Eleanor noticed her watching too, noticed the careful way Denise studied the house around her, the art on the walls, the value of things, in a manner that had nothing to do with appreciation and everything to do with appraisal. When the evening finally ended and Marcus and Denise's car pulled away from the estate, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what her son was attempting to do to her. Then she turned from the window, walked to her study, and began writing down every question Marcus had asked that night, word for word, in a journal that would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case her son never saw coming. Harold Bennett had spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous people in any legal dispute were rarely the ones shouting the loudest. They were the quiet ones, the ones who built their case slowly, methodically, while appearing entirely reasonable to everyone around them. Dr. Richard Coleman, as it turned out, was exactly that kind of dangerous. Harold hired an investigator he had used discreetly over the years, a man named Tobias Reed, who specialized in exactly this sort of quiet digging, and within 4 days, Tobias delivered a file that confirmed everything Harold suspected and several things he had not. Dr. Coleman's name appeared in 3 separate conservatorship cases over the past 6 years, each one following an almost identical pattern. A family member, usually an adult child under significant financial strain, would hire Coleman privately for an evaluation of an aging parent. In each case, Coleman's written findings supported the conclusion the paying family member needed. And in each case, the aging parent in question lost significant control over assets that were later, in 2 of the 3 cases, discovered to have been mismanaged or drained by the very family member who had sought the evaluation in the first place. One of those cases had resulted in a lawsuit against Coleman that was quietly settled out of court, the details sealed, the doctor's license somehow left untouched. Harold read through the file twice, his jaw tightening with each page, thinking not of Eleanor's $42 million fortune but of the other families, the ones without the resources or the connections Eleanor had, who had likely lost everything to a man wearing the credibility of a medical degree like armor. He thought of how many aging parents across this country had been quietly stripped of their independence, not because their minds had actually failed them, but because someone in their own family had found the right price for a doctor's signature. It made the fight ahead feel larger than Eleanor's estate alone, though Harold kept that thought to himself as he prepared to call her with the news. When Harold reached Eleanor that evening, he read her the details slowly, watching for her reaction, even though he could not see her face through the phone. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment after he finished, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the panic Harold might have expected from another client facing the same threat. Instead, she asked him a single practical question. She asked whether the settled lawsuit and the pattern across those 3 cases would be admissible if it ever became necessary to challenge Coleman's credibility in court. Harold told her it very likely would be, especially with the right expert witness to contextualize the pattern. Eleanor told him to begin preparing exactly that, quietly, in the background, the same way she had once quietly negotiated with vendors who did not yet know they were already beaten. The first formal evaluation session took place on a Tuesday morning, arranged by Marcus under the pretense of a routine wellness visit recommended, he claimed, by Eleanor's primary care physician. Eleanor knew better, of course, but she welcomed Dr. Coleman into her study with the same gracious hospitality she extended to any guest, offering him coffee, asking about his drive, behaving in every visible way like a woman with nothing whatsoever to hide. Dr. Coleman set up his clipboard and began the session with a series of questions designed to appear conversational while quietly measuring cognitive function. Questions about the date, about recent news events, about simple arithmetic disguised as small talk. Eleanor answered each question with a deliberate, careful cadence, never incorrectly, but always with a slight pause before responding, always allowing just enough silence to hang in the air that a man looking for decline would interpret it as decline, while a man looking for nothing more than a thoughtful, unhurried woman would see exactly that instead. She was performing, though Dr. Coleman had no way of knowing it, giving him precisely the kind of ambiguous, interpretable material his report would need in order to support whatever conclusion his client had already paid him to reach. What Dr. Coleman did not know was that every word of their session was being recorded, not secretly in violation of any law, but openly, with a small device Eleanor had placed on the side table and mentioned to him plainly before he ever sat down, a device he had dismissed as an old woman's harmless habit, rather than the calculated safeguard it actually was. Near the end of the session, Dr. Coleman asked Eleanor a question that revealed more about his intentions than he likely realized, asking her directly how she felt about her son taking a more active role in managing her financial affairs going forward. Eleanor met his eyes with the same steady calm she had used to close deals worth millions of dollars over the course of her career, and told him that she trusted her son to do exactly what was right for their family. A sentence that was technically true and would later be studied by lawyers on both sides for the different ways it could be interpreted. Dr. Coleman wrote something down on his clipboard, nodded, and told Eleanor their session had been very helpful, a statement that Eleanor found almost amusing given how little of herself she had actually revealed to him. After Dr. Coleman left the estate that morning, Eleanor sat alone in her study replaying the recording of their conversation, listening carefully to the specific language he had used, the leading nature of certain questions, the way he had framed neutral answers to sound uncertain in his own note-taking commentary muttered occasionally under his breath. She transcribed the most important portions herself, in her own handwriting, dated and signed, and placed the recording along with her transcription into a growing file that Harold had instructed her to keep in a location Marcus would never think to look. The trap, piece by piece, was assembling itself exactly as she intended. Eleanor invited Grace to Harold's office that week, deciding the time had finally come to bring her granddaughter fully into what she and Harold had been building quietly for over a month. Grace arrived still in her law school clothes, having come straight from a class on estate planning that suddenly felt less academic than it had that morning. She sat down across from her grandmother and Harold at the long conference table, and Eleanor, without unnecessary preamble, told her everything. The notepad Marcus carried into every visit, the evaluation session with Dr. Coleman, the pattern Harold's investigator had uncovered across 3 prior cases, the recording sitting safely in a file that would one day matter more than either of them yet fully understood. Grace listened with her hands pressed flat against the table, the color slowly draining from her face, as the pieces of the past several months rearranged themselves into a shape she had suspected but never wanted to fully confront. She thought of Marcus's text message weeks earlier, asking whether Eleanor had seemed forgetful, and felt something close to nausea at how casually her uncle had tried to recruit her into his own scheme without ever stating it outright. She asked Eleanor, her voice tight, how long her grandmother had known, and Eleanor told her, gently, that a mother often knows these things before anyone says a single word aloud, the same way a woman running an empire learns to sense a bad deal before the paperwork ever arrives. Harold then walked Grace through the second half of the plan, the part that mattered as much as the recordings and the investigator's file. Eleanor, with Harold's guidance, had spent the past 3 weeks restructuring significant portions of her estate into an irrevocable trust, one that named Grace as successor trustee rather than Marcus. One built with such deliberate legal precision that even a successful conservatorship ruling in Marcus's favor would grant him control over only a small fraction of what he believed he was fighting for. The bulk of Eleanor's $42 million fortune, along with full operational control of Whitfield Catering and Events, would remain protected regardless of what any court eventually decided about Eleanor's competency, because the structure did not depend on her competency at all, only on decisions she had already made, clearly and deliberately, while every lawyer in the room could attest she was of entirely sound mind. Grace asked her grandmother the question that had been building inside her since she sat down, asking why Eleanor had let this go on as long as it had, instead of confronting Marcus the very first week she suspected something was wrong. Eleanor's answer came slowly, and there was real sadness beneath the steadiness of her voice, a sadness Grace had rarely heard from her grandmother in 22 years of knowing her. Eleanor told her that some lessons could not be taught with a single conversation, that Marcus needed to walk far enough down this road to see exactly where it led, because a man saved from himself too early only returns to the same choice again later. She told Grace that this was not only about protecting a fortune, it was about protecting her son, even now, even from himself, in the only way that still remained available to her. Marcus paced his home office that night with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Dr. Coleman describe the results of the first evaluation session in careful, hedged, clinical language that gave Marcus less certainty than he had hoped for. Coleman explained that while there were certainly observations worth noting, brief hesitations, occasional repetition, nothing in the session rose to a level that would clearly satisfy a court on its own, and that additional sessions, along with statements from close family members and caregivers documenting a pattern of decline over time, would strengthen the case considerably. Marcus hung up the phone feeling the same restless frustration that had been building in him for weeks, the sense that this was taking far longer and requiring far more than he had originally believed it would. Denise stood in the doorway listening to his half of the conversation, and when he finally set the phone down, she asked him plainly how much longer this was going to take, reminding him, unnecessarily, that the $900,000 did not simply pause itself while they waited for a doctor to build a stronger file. Marcus snapped at her, something he rarely did, telling her that these things could not be rushed without raising suspicion, that a court would see through a hastily assembled case in an instant, and that if they wanted this to actually work, it needed to look thorough, careful, and above all, believable. What neither of them said aloud, though it sat heavily in the room between them, was the discomfort that had begun creeping into both their minds independently over the past several weeks. Denise had started noticing small things about Eleanor that did not fit the story they were building. The sharpness in her eyes during their Sunday dinners, the way she recalled details from years earlier with startling precision, even as she performed small hesitations over trivial things. Marcus had noticed it too, though he refused to sit with the thought long enough to examine it, because examining it meant confronting the possibility that his mother was not declining at all, that she was doing something far more unsettling, watching him just as carefully as he was watching her, and giving him exactly enough rope to hang himself with in the end. The second evaluation session arrived 3 weeks after the first, and Dr. Coleman entered Eleanor's study that afternoon with a subtly different energy than before, a slight edge of urgency beneath his professional composure that Eleanor noticed immediately. She had spent 30 years reading the body language of men trying to close a deal before their competitor could beat them to it, and Dr. Coleman, whether he realized it or not, carried exactly that same tension into her study now. Marcus had clearly pushed him for stronger findings, and Dr. Coleman had arrived determined to get them. His questions this time were sharper, less disguised as casual conversation, more directly probing at memory and orientation in ways that felt almost clinical in their bluntness. He asked Eleanor to recall details from their first session together, testing her memory of their previous conversation in a manner that would have felt invasive to any person regardless of age. Eleanor answered with the same careful, deliberate pacing she had used before, offering him small, harmless inconsistencies exactly where she wanted them, while remaining flawlessly accurate about every detail that actually mattered, every date, every name, every figure connected to her business and her estate. Near the end of the session, Dr. Coleman made a mistake that would later prove costly to him. Frustrated, perhaps, by the ambiguity of his own findings and the pressure from his paying client, he asked Eleanor a question that crossed clearly from clinical evaluation into something else entirely. He asked her, in a tone that had lost its earlier professional neutrality, whether she understood that her memory difficulties could put her entire fortune at risk if she did not cooperate more fully with the process. It was the kind of statement no ethical psychiatrist conducting a neutral evaluation should ever make. A statement that revealed, on the recording quietly capturing every word, that Dr. Coleman was no longer simply assessing Eleanor. He was pressuring her toward a predetermined outcome, exactly the kind of evidence Harold had told Eleanor to watch for, and exactly the kind of evidence that would later unravel everything Marcus had built. Eleanor did not react visibly to the threat buried inside Dr. Coleman's question. She simply thanked him for his time, told him she looked forward to their next session, and watched him gather his things and leave her study with the same gracious composure she had shown him from the very beginning. The moment his car pulled away from the estate, however, Eleanor picked up her phone and called Harold immediately, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, there was something close to relief in her voice. She told Harold that Dr. Coleman had finally given them exactly what they needed. Marcus met with his creditor that evening in a private booth at a restaurant far from his usual circles, a meeting he had been dreading and postponing for weeks. The man across from him, representing an investment group Marcus owed the bulk of his $900,000 to, slid a document across the table, outlining a final deadline, 90 days, after which legal collection proceedings would begin. Proceedings that would almost certainly become public, and would almost certainly end Marcus's career in finance permanently, along with whatever remained of his marriage, to a woman who had made clear from the beginning that she had no intention of living through public financial ruin beside him. Marcus left that meeting with the 90-day deadline sitting in his chest like a stone, and for the first time since this entire scheme began, he allowed himself to fully calculate how much time he actually had left. A conservatorship petition, even a strong one, could take months to work through the court system. 2 evaluation sessions were not enough. He would need at least one more session with Dr. Coleman, statements from Denise, and possibly from household staff, and a filed petition, moving through the courts within weeks, rather than months, if he had any hope of resolving his debt before the deadline arrived. The timeline that had once felt comfortably distant now felt impossibly tight, and Marcus, driving home that night, felt something shift inside him from calculated scheming into outright desperation. He called Denise from the car and told her about the deadline, and for the first time in this entire process, Denise's voice carried something that sounded almost like fear rather than ambition. She asked him what would happen if the petition did not move fast enough, and Marcus, staring at the empty road ahead of him, admitted that he honestly did not know. He told her they needed to accelerate everything, push Dr. Coleman for a final session sooner than planned, and file the petition within the next 2 weeks, regardless of whether the case felt fully ready. Denise was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before finally agreeing, though something in her silence suggested she was beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly how far outside of reasonable judgment her husband's desperation had carried them both. Harold called Eleanor 2 days later, with news that confirmed exactly what she had suspected was coming. Marcus had contacted Dr. Coleman requesting an accelerated 3rd and final evaluation session, and through a discreet contact Harold maintained at the county courthouse, he had also learned that Marcus's attorney had begun preparing a conservatorship petition for filing within the next 2 to 3 weeks. The timeline had compressed dramatically from what Harold and Eleanor originally anticipated, and Eleanor, sitting behind her desk with Grace listening nearby, understood immediately what this compression meant. Marcus was no longer moving carefully. He was moving out of panic, and panicked men made mistakes that careful men never did. Eleanor explained to Grace that this acceleration actually worked in their favor rather than against it, because a rushed petition filed in desperation would contain far more vulnerabilities than a carefully constructed one built over many patient months. She told Grace that the time had finally come to stop simply documenting Marcus's scheme and begin actively dismantling it, piece by piece, before he could ever file that petition with the court. The recordings, the transcripts, the investigator's file on Dr. Coleman's troubling pattern across 3 prior cases, the completed trust restructuring that Harold had finalized weeks earlier, all of it was ready. What remained was choosing the precise moment and the precise method to reveal everything, a decision Eleanor had been turning over carefully in her mind for days. Grace asked her grandmother what that method would be, and Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine smile Grace had seen from her in weeks. Eleanor told her that Marcus wanted a courtroom, so a courtroom was exactly where she would meet him, except it would not unfold the way he expected. Instead of Eleanor arriving unprepared and vulnerable to whatever narrative his lawyer and Dr. Coleman had constructed, she intended to arrive with her own attorney, her own evidence, and her own carefully built case exposing not her incompetence, but her son's calculated attempt to manufacture it. She told Grace that the 3rd evaluation session Marcus had requested would happen exactly as scheduled and that it would become the final piece of evidence needed to close the trap completely. The third and final evaluation session took place on a rainy Thursday afternoon, and Dr. Coleman arrived visibly more anxious than in either of his previous visits, aware, though he did not know exactly how, that Marcus needed this session to produce a conclusive result. He began the session with a directness that abandoned almost all pretense of neutral clinical evaluation, asking Eleanor pointed questions clearly designed to elicit responses that could be documented as evidence of significant cognitive decline. Eleanor, sensing that this was the session that mattered most, made a decision she had not made in either of the previous two sessions. She decided to stop performing hesitation entirely, and instead answered every single question with complete, unwavering clarity and precision. Dr. Coleman grew visibly frustrated as the session continued, his careful clinical language slipping further and further away with each answer Eleanor gave him flawlessly. Each date, each figure, each detail, recalled with a sharpness that directly contradicted everything his notes from the previous two sessions suggested. Finally, near the end of the session, his composure broke entirely. He set down his clipboard, leaned forward, and told Eleanor plainly that her son was going to move forward with the petition, regardless of what today's session showed, that the outcome had, in essence, already been decided before she ever answered a single question, and that her cooperation at this point would only make the process easier and less costly for everyone involved, including Eleanor herself. The words hung in the air between them, recorded in full by the small device sitting openly on the side table, a device Dr. Coleman had apparently forgotten was even there in the heat of his own frustration. Eleanor looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began months earlier, she allowed him to see exactly who he had actually been sitting across from all along. She told him, calmly and without a trace of hesitation, that she had known about her son's plan from the very first week it began, that every session between them had been recorded with her full knowledge and his implied consent given his awareness of the device, and that his own words, just spoken, admitting the predetermined nature of his findings, would soon be reviewed by a judge, a state medical licensing board, and quite possibly a courtroom full of families whose lives had already been damaged by exactly this same pattern of behavior in his previous cases. Dr. Coleman's face drained of all color as Eleanor May Whitfield stood up, walked calmly to her study door, and opened it, informing him that their session and his involvement in her son's case had officially come to an end. Marcus received the call from Dr. Coleman less than an hour after the final evaluation session ended, and the panic in the doctor's voice told him everything before Coleman even finished his first sentence. Coleman explained, stumbling over his own words, that Eleanor had known from the very beginning that every session had been recorded, that his own final statement about the predetermined outcome of the evaluation was now sitting on tape in the possession of Eleanor's attorney. Marcus sat frozen at his desk, the phone pressed against his ear, feeling the floor of his carefully constructed plan collapse beneath him in real time. He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time, running through the months of visits, the notepad, the questions disguised as concern, replaying every Sunday dinner where he had believed himself to be one step ahead of a woman who, he now understood with sickening clarity, had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her. He thought of his mother's small hesitations during those dinners, the pauses he had interpreted as decline, and understood now that they had been nothing more than bait, offered deliberately, patiently, for exactly as long as it took him to walk far enough down this road that there would be no quiet way back from it. Marcus called his attorney that same night, hoping desperately for some path forward that did not end in complete disaster, but his attorney's response only confirmed what Marcus already feared. With Dr. Coleman's credibility now catastrophically compromised, with a recorded admission of a predetermined evaluation outcome, and with Eleanor's team almost certainly prepared to present the pattern of Coleman's prior cases to the court, any petition filed now would not simply fail. It would very likely expose Marcus to serious legal liability of his own, potential findings of attempted financial exploitation of an elder, a charge that carried consequences far beyond simply losing access to his mother's fortune. His attorney advised him, in the strongest possible terms, to withdraw everything immediately and hope that Eleanor chose not to pursue further legal action against him. Marcus requested a meeting at his mother's estate 3 days later, and Eleanor agreed, though she made certain Harold and Grace were both present when he arrived. Marcus walked into the living room, looking nothing like the composed, calculating man who had sat across from Dr. Coleman months earlier. He looked instead like a man who had spent 3 sleepless nights confronting exactly what he had attempted to do to the mother who raised him, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way Eleanor had not heard from her son since he was a small boy. He did not attempt to defend himself or minimize what he had done. He told Eleanor everything, the debt he had hidden from everyone including Denise for nearly 2 years. The desperation that had convinced him a conservatorship was somehow different from theft, simply because he told himself it was. And the shame that had been sitting inside him since the moment Dr. Coleman's frantic phone call revealed how completely his mother had seen through him from the very beginning. He told her he understood if she never wanted to speak to him again, and he told her he understood if she pursued legal action against him for what he had attempted to do, because he no longer believed he deserved her protection from consequences he had brought entirely upon himself. Eleanor listened to her son's confession without interrupting. The same steady composure she had carried through every session with Dr. Coleman now turned toward the far more painful task of hearing her own child admit to trying to steal her mind's credibility along with her fortune. When Marcus finally finished speaking, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Denise reached over and took her husband's hand, bracing, it seemed, for whatever judgment Eleanor was about to deliver. When Eleanor finally spoke, her words surprised everyone in the room, including Harold, who had known her longer than anyone present. Eleanor told Marcus that she would not pursue criminal charges against him, not because what he attempted was forgivable, but because she understood, more than he realized, exactly how desperation could convince a person that an unforgivable choice was somehow reasonable. She told him she had built her entire fortune out of refusing to let hardship turn her into someone she could not respect, and she was not willing to let his hardship turn their family into something neither of them could recover from. But she told him, just as clearly, that the trust structure Harold had built would remain exactly as it was, with Grace as successor trustee, and that Marcus would need to earn back not access to her money, but her trust, through years of honesty rather than a single tearful confession in her living room. In the months that followed, Marcus did something he had not done in nearly 2 decades of adulthood. He asked for help. With Harold's guidance, though not his mother's money, Marcus met with a debt counselor and structured a repayment plan for his $900,000 in obligations, a plan that required him to sell the house he and Denise could no longer afford, downsize their lifestyle dramatically, and rebuild his finances slowly, honestly, and entirely on his own. Denise, to her credit, stayed beside him through the transition, though the marriage that emerged on the other side of it looked very different from the one built on appearances that had existed before, quieter now, more honest, stripped finally of the pretense that had nearly destroyed everything. Marcus began visiting his mother again, though the visits looked nothing like the calculated wellness checks of months earlier. He came without a notepad now, without questions disguised as concern, simply as a son who had nearly lost the most important relationship of his life to his own desperation, and had spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of rebuilding it. Eleanor welcomed him with the same steady warmth she had always shown him, though both of them understood, without ever needing to say it aloud, that something between them had changed permanently, not broken beyond repair, but reshaped into something more honest than it had ever been before. A year later, Eleanor May Whitfield stood in the gardens of the estate she had built with nothing but her mother's recipes and her own unbreakable will, watching her granddaughter Grace, now a licensed attorney working alongside Harold Bennett, review the final paperwork transitioning more operational control of Whitfield catering and events into Grace's capable hands. Dr. Richard Coleman's medical license had been formally suspended following a state board investigation that Harold's evidence had helped set into motion, an investigation that ultimately connected him to the pattern of exploitative evaluations stretching back years, protecting families Eleanor would likely never meet from the very scheme her own son had once nearly succeeded in using against her. Eleanor walked slowly through the garden beside Grace that evening, the same garden where she had once stood alone holding a photograph of her late husband, wondering how she would protect everything she had built from a threat coming from inside her own family. She thought now of everything that had happened since that evening, the recordings, the trust, the courtroom that never needed to convene because the trap had closed long before Marcus ever filed a single document. She thought of her son, humbled and rebuilding, and of her granddaughter, walking confidently now into the legacy Eleanor had spent a lifetime constructing. Eleanor May Whitfield had been told, in the quietest and cruelest way a family can tell someone, that her mind could no longer be trusted with the life she had built. She had answered that accusation not with anger, though she had every right to it, but with the same patient, deliberate intelligence that had carried her from a rented commercial kitchen to a $42 million empire. She had let her son believe, for as long as it took, that he was one step ahead of her, and in doing so, she had taught him, and everyone watching this story unfold, the same lesson she had spent her whole life proving true. The mind they tried to call unfit had been the very mind that outsmarted them all along, and the fortune they tried to take would remain exactly where it belonged, in the hands of a woman who had built it, protected it, and, in the end, used it to protect her family from itself.